Hello, welcome along to the home ground where sport intersects with property and business, and that's very pertinent because Western United have had their licence revoked by Football Australia, of course the newest A-League club, and Max Schiffman is with me. Max, it's very topical because it was a bold initiative. Western United have combined property with a new fan base out west, and a club that really has struggled for relevancy in the A-League, despite the fact that they won the championship a few years back. How have you seen all that play out?
Yeah, look, it's been interesting to observe from the outside. I mean, as people might have been aware, I was involved in one of the other A-League bids at the time with Team 11. So, I've always had an interest in seeing what's happened with Western United. And it was, probably, I'd say, surprising, but not necessarily that surprising that things have unravelled a bit given what we've learned the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, Western United, of course, have appealed that decision, so we await the nature of that appeal, and they are waiting on KAM or CAM to come up with the goods. That's the proposed new owner of Western United. They've had history, though, because they look to have bought Everton in the past, a Greek club and a mainland European club. Each time they haven't stumped up the cash. What's your word on the street about the way that may play out?
Yeah, well, as you just said, I mean, they've got a track record, right, of not completing deals. I've spoken previously about the fact that I genuinely hope that they would, but when you read some of the numbers, and not a surprise again having gone through the process, but when you've had the Western United club losing in the order of $11 or $12 million a year, it becomes a really hard prospect, I think, for an investor to come in and say, we're going to pick this club up with all those liabilities, with all the losses. Yes, we know there's a possibility of, delivering the new stadium and everything around it eventually, but it's a pretty big investment on the backdrop of an A-League which is struggling at the moment.
Well, let's go back in history because I think the context needs to be discussed. 2016 was the expansion model, the old FFA. It's now Football Australia, but it used to be Football Federation Australia, led by David Gallop. There was a number of clubs who put their hands up for the expansion licence. Team 11 was one in Melbourne, South Melbourne, Western United. Southern expansion in Sydney, amongst other clubs, but of course MacArthur got the licence. So we go back. Was the process fully transparent? My argument would be no, because the actual licence deal and the licence number wasn't made public. And as we know now, history will tell us that MacArthur paid a lot less than Western United. Was it done for the right reasons, or was it more a sugar hit as far as the highest bidder won the licence as opposed to the best bid? Because Team 11 had a lot of the infrastructure there with transport, community, local government support, probably a more established multicultural base to draw upon.
Well, you had people living there. That was a start. I mean, it is interesting to go back in time. As you said, the process kicked off in 2016. I got involved with Team 11 through 2017. And then the bid process was concluded in 2018. And so originally there were 15 clubs that put their hands up as potential expansions to the A-League. And the intention was that there were two that would be selected, which is MacArthur and W, as you mentioned. Team 11 for the longest time seemed like it was a front runner in the process. I think that's the feeling that we all had. And it was actually a bit of a shock that we didn't actually end up picking up the licence for Melbourne, but there was a lot of expectations. And there were a few elements of what we were offering that I thought were really compelling in terms of what the aspirations of a growing league should have been. I mean, population was number one. You had, 1.5 million people living around the centre of where our site would have been, which would have been in the heart of Dandenong. I mean, that's the size of Adelaide right there as an entire geography, with a very ethnically diverse geography, a huge football-loving geography, all the infrastructure there. At the time, we were talking about, working with the Dandenong Council. They were going to gift us land, well, not us, but, effectively the state land around the Dandenong station for a new stadium. But that was a much smaller piece of land than what Western United were dealing with out in Tarneit. But we had all those elements, and the fact that you had the infrastructure there available, you had the right demographic and the people there, it was a no-brainer. And that's why Melbourne City have sort of picked up and moved their geography now to the southeast, sort of building off the work that we had done. I think one of the key differences between our bid and Western was, I think, and I'm not saying Western United wasn't a genuine bid, but we were like a truly grassroots genuine bid. And one of the things we were really focused on was, because we thought we were a key expansion geography for the A-League, was that we would be more sensible about how we would set the club up in the early phases. So, I'll be quite open here. We put in a bid that actually staggered payments over a period of time as the club could sort of get itself ready and going, get the admin right, get everything happening, and then you would pay the license fee over a period of time. And I actually have forgotten the final figure, but it was 12 or 13 million. Like, it was not a small amount, but it wasn't a day one. Whereas what we understand is Western United basically offered 18 million, paid within 12 months, and off they went. So, long way of answering your question, but there's no question to me that it actually just came down to the money and not the sport.
And I can remember, hindsight's always a powerful weapon. We know that. But, David Gallop said at the time, the CEO of Football Federation Australia, fish where the fish are, right? Well, the last time I was at Tarneit, there weren't too many fish there. And the point being, it wasn't an established community, as you mentioned. They had a high licence fee. But it draws into question for me the sustainability model of some of the A-League expansion in the past. It really hasn't been there. It's been about the upfront payments, and you just go and sort out your club beyond that. Now, we know that obviously Canberra are close to getting a licence for next season, and they will be a start-up club. But for me, it draws into question, is this the last time, other than Canberra, we see a start-up model in the A-League? Do you need now a more sustainable structure moving forward, an established club with links into the community and so forth?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you've been there from the beginning, so you've seen both sides, right? And at the very beginning, a lot of them were startup clubs, weren't they, as well? So, look, you'd never say never, but there's certainly, I think, a level of confidence that comes with having an existing club with the infrastructure, with some brand, with some links into the local community already, and maybe elevating them up. I think the bigger question is, how do you split the geography enough where all the teams can remain viable? Because let's face it, Melbourne is still an AFL city. The fact that we have 3 teams here is really quite extraordinary for the amount of following that the A-League has. And you'd have to question whether there'd be room for a 4th team, right? I think, bring it back to what you were saying, you've got to look very carefully at where you want to be as a league, more strategically up front, and then decide that you want to put a new club there, which is, I think, how Canberra's going about it. But I wouldn't ever sort of think that they would run another open expansion bid, which basically came down to who's going to write the biggest check at the end of the day, because that's proven to be pretty ineffective.
And this current season, you just wonder whether the licence will be transferred or can be transferred to another entity. The Western United licence, Western Melbourne Group is the holding company. So, you'd have to be a lawyer to work this out exactly, but there's been instances where licences have been transferred, and whether that's on the table to maintain the playing group as it is, because John Aloisi's done some incredible things under duress with that club. They've played some excellent football over the duration, and you just wonder whether someone's floating in the wings waiting for that to happen.
Yeah, well, the on-field stuff hasn't been the problem for Western United. It's been all the stuff in the background, right? I mean, the industry better than anyone, Bash. Do you think there are people out there going, hey, why don't we just write a check to A-League and get going? Or do you think it's more likely that people are going to wait and see, and maybe the league has to run the club for a while?
Maybe, and it might be a negotiated outcome, because I know the reality of football in Australia is that you need other income sources. So for me, property is a good solution, but it's in the right areas with the right structure and the right partners. And I think Jason Sarasis and Western United were ambitious. They were absolutely killed, in a sense, by COVID. It really stopped them in their tracks. And I feel for them, because their ambition was absolutely notable, and it was plausible to a degree, but reality set in after COVID, and where a property deal could be done in the Wyndham Council, it was subject to a whole lot of factors, and one was the major stadium being built, which hasn't happened. It's the smaller version. So it's what happens now that's going to be the fascinating watch.
Yeah, I mean, I can empathise with the people in the A-League and FFA at the time, because, I could imagine, a bit like an episode of Utopia, you sort of get all the bureaucrats out there to Tarneit and you see this paddock and you go, geez, can't you see the stadium over here and there's houses here and, the practice stuff here? And it would have been a really sort of compelling vision if you bought into it. So I think the intention was right. I do understand that a lot of the commercial arrangements with Wyndham were actually only come to well after the licence was purchased, so that would have made an interesting negotiation. And Wyndham have been out there very clearly stating that as far as they're concerned, there's no risk to the land because they are the landowner until it's developed, so I'm not sure how all that unravels as well. But it was hats off for having that vision. Like, you could see how developing that circa 60 hectares of land and using the proceeds to build the stadium could have worked, and maybe the numbers in 2018 stacked up. But, when you saw costs go up the way they did the last 5 or 6 years, where you saw the Melbourne market sort of flatten out and get difficult, when you saw that the A-League wasn't performing perhaps as well as it should have been from a consumer perspective and income perspective, all those things have clearly come to roost at the moment.
Yeah, it's almost like a field of dreams, threatened by the perfect storm in a way.
Yeah, it was the whole build it and they'll come approach rather than here's a place where the people are. And, I think one of the things we've learned over the last little while is the importance of setting up your infrastructure in areas where they are accessible to an existing population. And the fact that, some of the major leagues have chosen to relocate their facilities from suburban areas into central areas has been for good reason. That's where they've gotten the scale, the capacity, and have had the supporting infrastructure to make those places work.
Yeah.
And the dream of a privately owned suburban stadium is a really interesting one. But maybe it proves it's just not ready. We're not ready for it here in Australia.
Yeah, and Western United, the first club to build its own stadium in A-League history, or try to build it, because it's now owned by Wyndham Council. 8 venues in 6 years before Ironbark. It's a lot. You just question, and again, hindsight, 2020 vision, it's easy to be an expert, but the corridor of football growth and multiculturalism is probably not in the Tarneit area. That's going to be another 20 years away. In the Geelong direction, for me, if you weren't going to go Team 11, Southeast, that was the area to...
I think that's right. And you can see in the demographics as well. So the west of Melbourne has really been growing predominantly from Indian migration, and India's not a historically strong football community. It's not to say that they won't come here and get involved in it, but it was certainly a little bit of a disconnect, I think, between the underlying demographic that's predominant there at the moment and the sport that was being pitched there. Now, that stadium would have been more than just a football stadium. It would have meant so much to the community, because you would have had events there, you could have had other sports there, it would have been multi-purpose. I know there were proposals for all sorts of other ancillary things around it, so there would have been, a whole precinct for people living in the area. So, again, I can totally see and buy into the vision, but sometimes the vision doesn't match the economics. No,
and to be fair to the economics, Stephen Conroy came out recently, that they've withstood the winds of COVID, and post-COVID they've returned a very small profit, but they've turned their finances around, the APL, and it needs to be applauded, because it was going in one direction a few years back. So it's a pity this has happened, to be honest. But
there's a difference between the APL being profitable or slightly break even versus the clubs. And if you believe what's been reported in the media, Western Melbourne Group was losing in the order of $11 or $12 million a year. So that's a very, very big loss to shoulder. What are we, 6 years now into operation? So that's a lot of money, in addition to the money they've paid for the licence to have to come up with every year and not get a return on.
Yeah, and their star striker a few years ago, Alexander Prijovic, they haven't actually sorted that out, and that's now resulted in the fact that they can't sign new players, which there's so many handbrakes up at that club. It really is watch this space. The appeal is ongoing. Whether the FA through APL take the licence back and hand it to another entity, and what happens to Western Melbourne Group, you'd have to have a crystal ball to work that out.
Yeah, I mean, there's any number of ways this could turn out, but I'm just trying to think through what would happen if APL just said thanks very much, the license is ours, and you go sort everything out, because that would end up being a very unhappy investor group with nothing left of value, really, because without an A-League license, there's no stadium, which means there's no land, which means I don't know how people are getting paid back.
Max, as a trailblazing project, Western United was supposed to build its own major stadium. How was this supposed to work?
Yeah, so look, obviously I'm not in the ins and outs of the deal, but I know a little bit about it in terms of A, how I would have approached it, but also B, you hear things around the place. So the premise was essentially that the Wyndham Council agreed to effectively gift the land to the Western Melbourne Group, not at zero cost. It was probably at a slight subsidised cost. And the premise was essentially that by developing certain portions and taking those proceeds, you could then invest in building the actual stadium itself. And then eventually WMG would own the stadium, and that could operate with the club coming out of it. And so from what I understand, there were various milestones along the way that had to be met. So for example, you've got the training facility that's been built already, so that was one of the milestones, and that would have unlocked the ability to draw on other parts of the land. And then there were further prerequisites, and one of the key milestones was effectively getting some substantial commencement on the stadium itself. Now, the stadium, and again, the numbers will vary, but that was probably a $100-odd million piece of infrastructure back in 2018. It's probably 150 to 180 now. That's how much costs have gone up. And so you would need to be able to extract a lot of value out of the land and the development to be able to fund that stadium.
And was it a domino effect that worked in reverse, in a sense that the costs just kept on going up and the numbers didn't match up?
So I think that's part of it. We've also had the best part of 4 years in Melbourne where land values haven't really risen in terms of residential values, but your costs have. So it's probably squeezed margins and squeezed the return they would have gotten out of it. And I also think just the passage of time and just the cost of running the club has probably caught them by surprise as well. So the amount of pressure it would have put on cash flow, let alone getting the project up and running through planning and everything, it took a long time. I don't remember the exact date, but the actual rezoning for the site only came in about 2023 because the land was just urban growth zone, undevelopable land at the time, but earmarked for future development. So even to get the thing up and running, you had to go through a rezoning process. So the council had to support it, the state government had to sign it off. I know from bitter experience how bloody long a rezoning process happens. So that of itself would have been really unhelpful to the guys at Western Melbourne. But you needed that to happen before you could start doing any of the actual physical work.
Yeah, so the ambition to build a major stadium in 2021 was unrealistic given all the barriers that were faced.
Well, they probably underestimated how incompetent the Victorian planning system is. Unfortunately, I've learned the hard way. But it's another example, and it's an interesting point, right? Like I often talk about, planning and the red tape and all the stuff that comes into it. But there are so many examples of things like this, of rezonings where everyone agrees. Do you know what I mean? Like it's one thing when you've got a really controversial rezoning. I don't know, you want to turn, a couple of blocks in a suburban street into 30-story towers. Of course, everyone's going to get really upset. But cases like this where the council owns the land, it wants this to happen. There's no one that's against this from getting up, and it still takes years and years and years to get through. And I bet you they called it some sort of fast track process, by the way, and it still took forever. So it's a little example, and I have this experience on multiple sites as well. Like the system just cannot deal with anything in a timely manner. And this is probably a prime example of where time is money. And in this case, that has not been their friend.
Yeah, and it just draws into question. We spoke to Matthew Chun a few weeks ago, actually, at Marvel Stadium about sports owning their own stadia around the country. It's always been a difficult argument in different sports. Do you think this will be put up as the model of why a tiered sport like the A-League, why the owners can't own their own stadium?
Yeah, I think it does. I think what this will do is set back the idea of private ownership for a very long time. Where I think it will work is when the leagues own their facilities like the AFL does. There's a big difference between those two things. So there'll be different economics involved, there'll be different subsidies involved because the leagues get, money from federal and state governments at various times. They can reinvest the proceeds from the highest level where they get all the money from media and things like that. It's going to be a lot more viable for the peak bodies or the leagues to own the facilities than it is for private investors to come and do a WMG kind of deal. And we should remember, I touched on it before, but the land is effectively being subsidised and gifted by the people of Wyndham Council, right? So there's no way that you could have gone and paid a commercial rate for that land and then made this work. Like, there's just no feasible way. So it was only through this partnership, and Wyndham obviously saw the value in the partnership too in terms of creating the precincts. But if you didn't have that commitment from the local council, you could never do this on a purely arm's length basis.
Yeah, and if the APL take the licence back, or Football Australia, the way those assets are going to be broken up to a potential investor is going to be so fascinating.
It will be, and I mean, who knows, maybe the APL will partner with Wyndham Council and deliver a stadium. I mean, that's not impossible. It's not going to happen, but it's not impossible, but that may be the sort of intervention you need to get something like this off the ground. Might not be a crazy idea.
Will this stadium be built, and if so, how?
Look, we'll find out very, very soon what happens with the licence, but I've moved into the no camp. I don't think it's going to happen. Main reason is I think the Wyndham Council's probably been very accommodating in this, and there'll be a reputational issue for them as much as anything else. And so sort of re-gifting this land to a new entity on the promise of a stadium happening, I think will be a step too far for them to accept.
And you know what the real pity is out of all this is, 2023 Australia hosts the Women's World Cup. We're about to host the AFC Asian Cup for women next year in 2026. We are in desperate need as a sport football for rectangular stadia.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, and we'll never catch up with the need. But maybe a 15,000 a seat stadium in Wyndham isn't the way to do it. We'll have to look at different ways of accommodating that growth.
Max, I get so frustrated when speaking housing with you because, for me, we're talking about the problems more than the solutions. So let's zero in on two things: non-market public housing. What can the government do to stimulate the overall supply problem it has by way of public housing? Well,
there's really only one thing governments can do, and that's throw money at the problem. I mean, that's the sort of simplistic way of looking at it. But it's kind of true that the reason we've had a shortfall in public housing in Australia is because governments across many decades, across different colours of government, across all levels of government, haven't actually been making the direct investment in it. There was a period of time, back sort of after World War II, where there was a big investment in housing commission and all these other things, and that generated a large proportion of public housing, publicly owned, and over time that was sort of whittled down. And so we went from something like, can't remember the exact number, but 6 or 7% of total housing stock being publicly owned, to that number being about 3.5% across the nation. So you've just seen that steadily drop off. And that 3.5% is not only the public, like the true sort of government-owned housing, but also what we call social housing, which is effectively third-party non-profit agencies that own and operate these homes on behalf of themselves, but with various government subsidies. So, as I said, the thing you can do is spend more money. The federal government at the moment has this Housing Future Fund, which is a $10 billion commitment, and under that, they expect to deliver 40,000 new homes, 20,000 affordable and 20,000 social. Affordable being a slight discount to market or prevailing market price. But to bear that in mind, right, 40,000 out of the 1.2 million they say they're going to build, they're not going to build that many. But even if you take the real number, which is about 900,000, it's still 4.5%.
That's a drop in the ocean, isn't it?
It's an absolute drop in the ocean. Yeah. And the frustrating thing is for someone like me, and I develop market housing, I'm not a social housing provider, but because all the focus is on the 3 or 4%, because that's the sort of headline-worthy housing, we're doing more for poor people. I sort of get the logic in terms of the messaging, but it's almost at the expense of all the market housing. And the more you ignore market housing, the more the non-market has to do the heavy lifting. And that's what we're seeing at the moment.
Are we able to see greater structural reform to make both non-market and market housing more affordable. I know we've spoken about this, but what are the immediate steps government can make?
Well, yeah, the silly thing is that any sort of planning and regulatory reform will impact all types of housing equally. And in fact, at the moment, non-market, the public housing style development has multiple advantages compared to developers, who are doing private housing. So, for example, social housing providers, they pay less stamp duty or no stamp duty. They pay less or no land tax. They get fast tracks through planning processes that the private sector can't access. They actually get to not pay GST along the way, which is something that new development has to cop. So they've got all these advantages already relative to private sector, and guess what? They're still not building anywhere near enough. Now, imagine if you applied some of those things to private sector housing, we would see way more housing get delivered in terms of new supply. And so it's just interesting to observe it's got all these advantages already and it gets through processes quicker, and yet it's still struggling to actually get invested in enough.
Is that because of the lack of volume of investment from government, or is it from other factors, do you think?
Look, it's a combination. I mean, the social housing providers have the same feasibility problems that private developers do. So, the cost of building for them goes up as much as it does for us. So they have the same issues. They still need to get bank funding. Sometimes people in government either forget or just fail to understand that when it comes to bank funding, a heavy sort of balance sheet with lots of assets is irrelevant because they lend you money on cash flow, right? So I've heard this from, I won't say which state politician, who's no longer in the parliament, but he used to say, well, we've got all these social housing groups, they've got hundreds of millions of dollars of properties on their balance sheets, they're just lazy. And not understanding that, well, no, the banks will lend on cash flow because you have to service debt. And when people are paying rent that's below market, you haven't got much cash flow to actually borrow against. And so that was a constraint. And so the Housing Future Fund is filling some of those gaps in terms of debt and giving social housing providers the capacity to deliver new housing. But there are often these really fundamental economic misunderstandings that come from our politicians that lead to worse outcomes.
Okay, what about market housing and the political hand grenade, which is tax reform, Max?
Oh, yes, lots of talk about tax reform. Productivity is the other buzzword at the moment, by the way. But yeah, look, there's a lot of talk again about whether we remove negative gearing or limit it to one or two properties. They're talking about, reducing the capital gains concession, which, those two things hand in hand arguably make a difference to, the sort of investment decisions people make. And then there's even some wild talk, I don't think it'll happen, but they're even talking about, removing the capital gains exemptions for your private residence. So imagine all of a sudden that you'll have to pay tax on selling your house on top of the commission you pay the agent and on top of the stamp duty you pay to acquire the next property as well. So it feels at the moment like there is nothing off the table except maybe spending a bit less as government.
And would it be fair to say a lot of developers, investors are moving away from a highly taxed jurisdiction such as Victoria into other states who are a little bit more encouraging investment and, I suppose, progression in the industry? Yeah,
look, that is a very clear trend. So Victoria's done a couple of things that have made it pretty unattractive for investors in relative terms. And remember, it's all relative. People will still invest here, but it's to what degree? And so what we've seen is the combination of a much more aggressive land tax regime, plus also some new tenancy rules that have come in and have made it far more in favour of tenants who don't do the right thing as opposed to the landlords who do the wrong thing. And so that's pushed investors out of Victoria in relative terms. And you're seeing that in the data. So there are much more, as a proportion, first home buyers in Victoria than there have been for a long time, and also relative to other states. So you'd say, well, that's a good thing, right? We've got rid of these evil investors who want to negative gear all their properties, and we've got first homeowners coming in. And that's true to a point. But what's been lost in that is as you push more and more investors out, and yes, you get your short-term sugar hit of owner-occupiers and first homeowners coming in, if you're not replacing that with new supply, which is what's happening, over the long term, that becomes disaster because a lot of housing needed to be seeded by an investor getting involved in the first place. A lot of the apartments that were built between sort of 2014 and 2018, the last boom, were sold to investors. We're not selling to investors now, and therefore apartment supply has gone through the floor. So you can see the impact of that in the mid and long term. And so what we're actually seeing now is a lot of investors are taking their money, choosing to be in other states. I have friends and anecdotes of people that have said the same thing to me. You know, from my perspective and in my business, we mostly sell actually to owner-occupiers, so it's not been a bad thing for us, but it's certainly taken out a large proportion of that new supply, which is actually underpinned by investors.
And a final one on short stay reform, short-term rental reform. Is that more a high-vis political opportunity to get up there and say we're doing something with no real practical impact?
Well, you've been hearing me enough, Bash, to know that almost everything is just a political headline, and that's yet another one. I mean, the evidence is pretty clear that all these Airbnb taxes that have come out, which is what I think it's 8.75%, you know, on your fees as a tax, has done nothing to stimulate, you know, mid or longer term rentals in these sort of regional areas. All it's done is made going away for the weekend a bit more expensive, and nor would it ever have really changed it, because let's be honest, a lot of the places where you've got these short stays are places people don't live, if you know, on a daily basis. They're regional towns that people want to go visit on the weekends. So the idea that you're somehow going to displace renters and short-term people with long-term owner-occupiers in some of these areas is fanciful, and it's not proving to be the case.
Well, let's hope it's not going to be a short stay for Western United in the A-League, because they've got a fair few headwinds in the future that they have to overcome.
Well, let's hope the Victorian government doesn't tax them 8.75% on top of everything else.
Okay.
It wouldn't surprise me, though.
We'll see you soon on the home ground, Max.
See you next time.